Ladies and gentlemen, this is the 12th and final round.
Right hand, Golovkin steps in and down he goes again. Unbelievable. Mayweather makes him pay. What a rookie mistake. A sensational left hook by De La Hoya.
It's facts. I'm the best. You know what I mean? Sometimes I don't want to believe it myself, but it's the truth. I'm the best. I'm going to show you how great I am.
From Southern California, this is the Last Round Podcast.
Welcome back to this week's episode of the Last Round Boxing Podcast. No Mike again this week. He should be back next week. But I have another guest that steps in for Mike. Last week, I had somebody, but this time, this guy, I think he's been on before. It's been a while since he's been on here on the pod, but he was definitely the first guy that I met in this media sphere of combat sports, fighting, MMA, boxing, I guess sports media, if you want to call it that. He's an MMA writer for multiple outlets. I'll let him throw it in there because if I get one wrong, he's probably gonna be pissed off at me. But I met him probably 10 years ago almost. We were both at page2sports.com, which is now defunct. But we ran the combat sports section. I think we did pretty good for the time that we were there. But yes. MMA writer and reporter and maybe journalist Ed Carbajal joins me here on the Last Round. Thanks for returning, Ed.
Thanks for having me, brother. I mean, it's been a while since we've created content together. Currently, I'm writing for Spectation Sports. I write fighter features for them. Spectation Sports is a streaming platform. We actually do have CES boxing for you boxing fans if they would like to watch the guys coming up on spectationsports.com. And my MMA news, I also co-host the Coast to Coast Combat Hour podcast where we talk about all things fighting from coast to coast. I do that with my buddy Matt Hawkins. And I'm always writing and trying new things out, as you know, all over the place. So we're wrote for Sure Dog before, since you and I wrote, obviously from Proof Media, Sure Dog, champions.co, 137 PM, lots of other outlets before I landed where I'm at now. But it's, you and I have always kept in touch, and it's always nice to talk fight business with you.
All the time, man. All the time. Like I said, I'm glad I teed you up to name all those outlets because I wasn't going to remember all those, but you've been around the business for a while and continue to do so. But obviously, this weekend we have competing MMA, UFC, for that matter, and Canelo Alvarez events in the same city, probably within maybe less than a mile, probably closer than that, in Las Vegas this upcoming Saturday, the 14th of September, from Las Vegas, as I mentioned, from the T-Mobile Arena for Canelo Alvarez on Prime Video, Amazon, and DAZN. It's a joint pay-per-view. Super middleweight unified titles, 168 pounds. Canelo Alvarez, 61-2-2, goes up against Edgar Berlanga, 22-0. So as I mentioned, Ed, you're the Last Round Podcast resident MMA expert. So anytime we need info on the MMA world, you're the guy that we go to. So who better to come on to talk, especially because the UFC, obviously they've had competing events in the past on the same date. But this one feels a lot more significant because it's at that new arena, the Sphere in Las Vegas. And I believe the UFC is the first sport to take over that arena. So let me ask you this. Did Dana White, the president of the UFC, did he think by booking the Sphere on the same weekend that Canelo Alvarez usually goes on, Mexican Independence Day weekend, did he think he was going to be able to take over that weekend from boxing by booking the Sphere?
I think I don't know if that was part of, I don't know if that was all of his thinking, I should say. Obviously, I can't speak for the man, but from my point of view, his whole thing was he just wanted to be the first combat sports event in that venue because of, it's relatively new still in the grand scheme of Vegas. Anything that goes on there, people talk about it for months. And since there hasn't been any combat sports there, he wanted to be the first one in there. I actually just read one of the interviews I read this morning, which I believe was with the Las Vegas Review-Journal from this morning, where that was one of the points he made, was being first in there before anyone else. I know even Eddie Hearn was talking about trying to get in there, and they're friends, Hearn and Dana White, and he was like, no, he's like, sorry, Eddie, I'm first. And the Dana White definitely likes to try to innovate when it comes to producing combat sports events. So I think that was being first in there was probably more because he wanted to be the first one back during COVID. If you look at his track record, he likes to try to be first and be the guy that kind of like everyone kind of follows behind when it comes to certain things. So I think that was more important. I don't know if that was really on his radar. I think there was some funny things going on with the negotiation side of whether or not Canelo was going to do something or who he's boxing under or whatever, because I know there was something with Golden Boy and De La Hoya, because De La Hoya is going to be at the UFC event versus, I guess trying to throw shade at Canelo. But I know John Morgan just asked Dana White about that yesterday or over the weekend or recently. And he said it's for Grind City Media that he did the interview for. And he said, he's like, yeah, he can come, but he's not getting any VIP treatment. Like if he's coming, it's because he bought a ticket. Very expensive ticket.
Yeah. No, that's true. And I'm glad you brought the Oscar De La Hoya bit up, because that just recently, I think De La Hoya just recently revealed that he was planning on going. But that just goes to show you is it hatred? Is it disdain that he has for Canelo Alvarez, who, everybody knows that when Canelo Alvarez left Golden Boy, there was a lot of profit that Canelo Alvarez took from Golden Boy when he departed that company. So, De La Hoya being the president and CEO of that company, I'm sure he still has a bitter taste. And, they both always talk crap about each other as the time goes forward anyways. So that's not surprising at all. But in terms of who's on the card, because I know, what was it last year when Dana White or the UFC had a Mexican Independence Day weekend card, but they had wasn't it a Mexican fighter headlining that card?
Yeah, it's the same too. That it was the same ones that are on this card.
It's the same ones, right?
Yeah, and
so what's the is it because Canelo's going the same day? Is that what's affecting it?
I'll be honest. I'll be straight up, man. The one thing that's bothering me about it, which is not for nothing, and I'm actually kind of. It's funny how fate has called us together to record this, because we're two Mexican American combat sports guys, that we're talking about this weekend. That's historically been a boxing, like, Mexican boxing for Mexican Independence Day, Cinco de Mayo, whatever it is. It's always been boxing that leads the way as far as the fight game goes, as long as combat sports has been a form of entertainment. So my problem with this is, you just mentioned the fight. So Shevchenko and Grasso are the co-main event. They fought before for the one that you're talking about, but they're the co-main event. The headliner is Sean O'Malley and Merab Dvalishvili. There are other Mexican fighters on this card, but I would be remiss if I didn't say, like, I'm calling it UFC 306. They call UFC Noche, Riyadh, with all the names are attaching to it. This is just another pay-per-view in a unique venue. It's UFC 306. That's another very popular hashtag for it. So I've been referring to it as such. I don't think, as far as much fanfare they're throwing at our culture on the UFC side, I think our blood is going to call us to the Canelo Alvarez event. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, absolutely. So the recent news for, especially in the last week or the last few days or so, is that ticket prices have been going down for the Sphere. You know, I mean, I think everybody knew that any event that happens there, especially the first sporting event, which was probably going to be some type of combat sport, the tickets were going to be extremely expensive. So I don't think people were surprised about that. But with like SeatGeek and all these screenshots you see from these Twitter accounts and all that of the drop in prices, maybe they're not selling. I mean, do we know, you know, from your side, you know, how well it's been selling? Has the UFC kind of indicated, or have you heard anything in terms of how well it's been selling?
No, and it seems like I'll tell you who's keeping good track of it. He writes for Forbes. Trent Reinsmith. If you follow him, he writes for Forbes. He used to write for Bloody Elbow before they got sold or bought or whatever by GRV Media. But he's keeping track of that. So the last post he put was that there's still plenty of availability. And another thing about the ticket prices too, I mean, I think they overshot. The thing is, those prices have been, UFC ticket prices have been going up and up and up and up for years. Even like at the Garden here, like I remember being able to get tickets for like $200 so bucks, and now it's almost close to rent payments if you're a single man, and that's for the regular Garden. Never mind the Sphere. So,
Madison Square Garden, New York. Yeah.
Yes.
For our UK listeners, it's Madison Square Garden, New York.
Yeah, the Garden. We call it the Garden around here.
Yeah.
Because there's only one Garden as far as we're concerned when it comes to arenas. But
not
anyway,
the Boston Garden, huh? Or the TD Garden or whatever.
No, I'm sure they trust me. There's a lot of for your other sports. There's a lot of Boston, New York beef over stuff like that. But yeah. So. And that's the other thing about it, when the ticket prices came out, that's the first thing everyone noticed was how expensive it was. And even UFC friendly media himself, Kevin Iole, that was one of the questions he brought to Dana White. And Dana White tried, you know, because he's a gazillionaire, so he was like, "Oh, it's only $1,500." And even Kevin Iole was like, "Yeah, that's still expensive. Like that's still a lot of money." If you look at maybe a month ago. He did the interview with him because, you know, he's his own thing now, Kevin Iole, since he left Yahoo. So yeah, I mean, I don't think it's going to be a sellout. I feel like they're going to take a hit. What I think 20 million in the hole is what I last read. But they are spending a lot of it. One thing I'll say is, like, I like that they're finally trying something different with their presentation, because the UFC has been wash, rinse, repeat since you know, Dana White's been in charge of it. And I do like that they're trying something different. I know there's going to be a lot of Sphere-related stuff to Mexico's history in between rounds. In the press release they sent, there's exclusive fight kits that the fighters are going to be wearing for the event. I want to read off. They said that each section. It's going to be like a 6-part series of like Mexican like history and culture through the years in between the fights. So
like on the screen.
Yeah, in there. And so as cool as it sounds, I'm wondering how that's going to translate to viewers at home, you know? Because at the end of the day, it's the fights that should be what you know, draw people to everything. But I do like that they're trying something different. So people, of course, are wishing, you know, that everyone hates the big rich guys. So people are you know, counting on this to like be a miss for the UFC. They've had so many hits for a long time that, you know, people are feeling it almost seems like they're rooting for him to fail. I wrote something in my newsletter where I'm like, you know, everyone's saying it's failing now because of the ticket prices, no sale, whatever. But we don't know what's going to happen until Monday, until actual Mexican Independence Day. So we got to wait and see what happens. I mean, for all we know, people could decide that night. You know, maybe somebody does well in the casinos and they go they go to the Sphere instead of, you know what I mean? Like, who knows what the tickets are going to be that night if they don't sell. So I don't know. Yeah, but that's definitely a big thing hiccup. Like if you're in Vegas and you want to go see a fight, I mean, chances are, you know, Canelo's up your alley when it comes to economics.
Let me ask you this in terms of the social media effect during and maybe after both events. Do you think the Sphere, because it's a new arena, UFC, it's first time there, it's obviously going to be very unique, and this might be the first time since that Sphere arena has opened that it's been accessible to like a live television format, that people can watch essentially all over the world. Do you think that intrigue will take over social media, in terms of like trending stuff like on Twitter, X, Instagram, and all that? Do you think that might overshadow or override the Canelo effect and the event that he's doing across the street?
I think we have to see. I think we have to see because, again, I don't know how that experience is going to translate to folks on watching at home and on their phones. Usually when the UFC is on, they do take up. I mean, but it's my I'm talking about my For You feed, so I'm not sure.
Right.
I'm not sure how much they'll trend, especially again on a night like that. It's going to be interesting who captures people's eyeballs. What time does the first bell for that event, the boxing?
I think it's 6 Pacific, 9 Eastern, I believe.
So it looks like it's going to be earlier because
do you remember when Canelo fought Kovalev years back, and there was also a UFC event on the same night?
Yeah, it was the BMF title. Yeah.
Correct, yeah. And then Canelo, he waited in his locker room, I think, so the main event of that BMF main event could finish. So do we see that happen again this Saturday, or vice versa?
So I don't think so, because as much as I'm interested in the fight between O'Malley and Dvalishvili, but it's not Jorge Masvidal and Nate Diaz. You know what I mean? Like, as far as when you talk about star power and the eyeballs that they draw, the casuals know who those fighters are, and they're going to be trying to tune in to watch. I don't think O'Malley. I mean, I know O'Malley has O'Malley has that fan base that I'm too old for, though. You know what I mean? Like, he's got that weird streamer Twitch people fan base.
That's his section,
yeah. So I'm like, we'll have to see, but I don't think. I mean, given what the weekend is bringing, I feel like the eyeballs will be more on Canelo, just because I mean this guy, his opponent. The fights on that card. If I was looking at the quality of fights on the card, those are more interesting to me overall in the combat sports space, like as far as competitive matchups. Because, not that O'Malley and Dvalishvili aren't. That's a really good bantamweight fight, but I feel like that would have been better for something else. Like if it was Brandon Moreno and somebody else, like Brandon Moreno and Figueiredo for a 5th time or whatever it is, I would definitely say, oh, man, not for nothing. I'll watch Canelo on Sunday. You know what I mean? For me, if it was that, it'd be different. But I feel like they just dropped the ball with what they're doing and the love letter to the Mexican people that Dana White keeps saying. I just don't feel like it's not grabbing me. Like I said, just because my dad boxed. I'm used to this being a boxing weekend. So again, it could just be my old fashioned ways. But I feel like no, I don't think. I don't think so, but we'll see Saturday.
Will Dana White be watching the Canelo fight cage side right there like he has in the past? Because I think there was a photo from people in the stands once that zoomed in on him, and there was a Canelo fight on the same day. It might have been that BMF one. It might have been the same one, but he was streaming the Canelo fight at the same time while there was fights going on in front of him. Does he do the same thing this Saturday? A lot of people forget that Dana White is a boxing guy. His knowledge of the sport. A lot of people don't remember that he's a boxing guy. He's a boxing fan. And his beef is not. He doesn't have any issues with Canelo.
It's those people that are booking the venue and stuff. The
MGM, at MGM,
yeah.
he said that he has beef with MGM, right?
Yeah, so the issues are with them. He actually likes Canelo. I mean, I think I wouldn't be surprised if he's watching it on his phone. The only reason I would say,
do you know what the beef is with MGM property?
there's an ESPN interview he did. I can't think of it off the top of my head because I wrote a piece on it and linked to it a few weeks ago, but it already left my mind.
Yeah.
But it's actually, I mean, the newsletter I plugged, I've been sharing the UFC Noche thing. I linked to it in there, my little take on this whole weekend for that event. But the link to that article is in there. But yeah, he mentions there's history and there's a lot of history with them beefing with, and it's weird because he said it's not with the MGM people. It's a specific person. Not the folks at the casino itself, but whoever handles their events, organizations, and stuff. So, the thing about Las Vegas, you ever see that? I'm sure you've seen the movie Casino. Like,
Yeah.
There's definitely like even though it's a big city, it's a small city and there's small town beef, such like in every small town. And it may not make big news, but I feel like that has something to do with it. Whatever it is, it seems. Very personal, way back to when they used to have events like crazy in the MGM Grand when the UFC was still growing. So it probably goes that far back.
So Turkey Al-Sheikh of Saudi Arabia, he's now fully involved in these combat sports, especially in boxing. He just put on his first U.S. event over here in Los Angeles at the BMO soccer or football stadium, however you want to, wherever you're out around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And he was trying to negotiate with Canelo to fight Terrence Crawford. And they were publicly, Turkey Al-Sheikh was more publicly negotiating. And there was I think Canelo had said, or his team had said that, when Turkey Al-Sheikh was in Los Angeles, Eddie Hearn had texted Canelo and said, "Oh, hey, do you have time? He wants to meet you." And Canelo, I guess couldn't. He's busy or something. And reportedly, Turkey was maybe a little upset by that he's like, "Oh, if I want to meet you, you need to meet me," or So I guess it kind of started from there, but Turkey Al-Sheikh has, I think, went on record. I think that ESPN article that you were talking about, where there was a quote in there that said, he's like, "Oh, we're gonna eat him alive or eat him."
Mm-hmm.
I'm paraphrasing, but he's essentially talking about the competition on that same day, this Saturday. How do you view? I mean, because obviously the UFC has been involved in the Middle East for a couple of years now, especially during the pandemic. They went over there on Fight Island and all that stuff. But with Turkey Al-Sheikh now coming into boxing, especially now in the U.S., and now being involved with this UFC card on Saturday, how does the MMA fan base take to him going into your sport?
I feel like, because when you talk about the MMA fan base, there's folks like myself and Matt that are well aware of what he brings to the table and what he can do when it comes to creating fights that folks want to see. But I mean, when you look at the MMA fan base now, I don't think they know enough about him to have any sort of feelings about him. Like you and I had a discussion briefly when you were out here in New York visiting. We talked about him quickly, and I told you my opinion is I think he's the guy that can fix everything that's wrong with making the fights people want to see, whether it be boxing or MMA. I think he's the guy that can make those fights happen, because at the end of the day, what is it always about? It's about money, right? And if you have bottomless, if your pockets have no end and all you have is money to make the fights happen that you want to happen, then I think he's the guy, because he doesn't care about losing money. Even Dana White said that for him, it's nothing. He doesn't, whatever he does, he doesn't lose any money because he just has so much of it. So I mean, there's a video of him walking around holding Dana White's hand like he's his chick.
I saw that. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like Dana White doesn't do that with most people. And obviously, the Riyadh season branding is because he's throwing money at this event. There's things on the table that he keeps dropping little hints at. Somebody just asked him about doing stuff with boxing and if he's going to be working with Turkey. And, he just smirked and was kind of like, we'll see. It was after the last week's Contender Series event where people just poke his brain a lot after he signs the new Youngbloods to the UFC. So
I think that was Alan Dawson, who asked him that. He's more of a boxing guy, but he's been on our show quite a few times. So I think I know exactly who asked him that question.
Yeah. So, and you saw his responses. So it's like whatever they're talking about. I mean, it looks like, and you got to remember Dana White's, he's getting up there in age too. That the Sports Business Journal article I read today, I found it odd that they put up, it was almost like a puff piece on the UFC's legal counsel, Hunter Campbell, and just kind of like they mentioned it a couple of times how he's going to be the heir. He's younger than Dana White, and he's supposed to be like the heir apparent. Like if Dana White decides to step down, it's going to be Hunter Campbell that runs the organization. Like he's the one dealing with the fighters now. They've compared him to Lorenzo Fertitta a couple of times. Dana White referred to him as his wartime consigliere, which means, if this is the guy that has the actual mental capacity for all these business moves, you're just kind of a figurehead since Endeavor took over. Which, I mean, when you think about it, if you look back at pre-Endeavor UFC 2015 and earlier, it was Lorenzo was the person that at the end of the day was making all these. Dana White is the president, but Lorenzo Fertitta was the actual like power behind him that was carrying the UFC. Him and the Fertitta brothers in the Station Casino money. So, I just found that interesting that was published today, and it was almost like promoting Hunter Campbell. So, and what all the other stuff Dana White's doing with the power slap and all these other weird things that he's kind of involved in, it's almost like he's planning his retirement. You know what I mean? Like he keeps saying he wants to keep putting on events as long as he can. But I mean, I personally see him. I heard him say only a couple of years ago when someone asked him a question, and he said, "That's not my job." And when he said that, I was like, you know what? You're not talking like an executive that runs a company anymore. You're talking like an employee. When someone says that's not my job, you sound like an employee. And he is. I mean, Ari Emanuel is his boss, whether he wants to admit it or not. Ari Emanuel is his boss. So it's definitely. I think in the next 5-10 years we're going to see things change especially with the antitrust lawsuit that's coming up too. There's 2 dates. I forget what they were. One is soon though. I think one is in October. I mean, things could be changing for that sport. I mean, they've already. I think they've peaked, and this is kind of a symbol. This event this weekend with how much it's costing and how much they might be losing. I think that's a sign of maybe you guys have you made it. So now you're kind of like a WWE level where you're just kind of always going to be around.
You're a brand.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. For the Sphere, you were mentioning that ESPN article. I actually found it. It was written by Mike Coppinger of ESPN. Mm-hmm. So the Sphere is essentially the first. Not essentially. I think it is the first venue on the Vegas Strip that is not controlled by MGM Properties. You were talking about the Garden, Madison Square Garden. Mm-hmm. The company that owns Madison Square Garden, they're called the Madison Square Garden Company, is in charge of the Sphere. Mm-hmm. So, and then in this same article, Dana White tells ESPN that MGM has done nothing but disrespect him mm-hmm. and the UFC for 20 years. But what is he? What does that mean? Is he just upset that they did a competing event with Canelo across the street? Or because from a fan's perspective, and obviously I'm asking you this because you're more tapped into the MMA community, but from a fan's perspective like mine, if you're feeling disrespected by a property or, in business like that or something, why do you keep going back to those properties?
Yeah.
Is this a one-time thing that he's just upset about because they're competing against him on the same night? Or is the 20 years of disrespect that, as he calls it, is there a pattern there? Like, what are we looking at?
I mean, I think it's more because he's put so much money in the marketing behind this for it to be so like a Mexican themed thing, and for them to just compete against it with someone that's going to be a strong draw away from that. I think that's all we're getting is the sour grapes out of him for that. That's what I think.
I mean, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
I was thinking about it, and I was like, okay, well, I'll ask Ed on the show, but that's the first thing I thought. I was like, oh, well, if you had all this animosity towards the MGM property, like the company and the executives, I mean, a lot of your fights are in Vegas at their properties. What I can see, like, if you do one every 2 years, or or you start doing more in New York or Texas, but so I did take it as maybe he was just upset because, like you said, he's been putting so much money into this event that he's not getting the most bang for his buck, if you want to look at it like that. So, kind of turning to attention to the actual boxing fight with Canelo Alvarez versus Edgar Berlanga. Are you aware of Edgar Berlanga? I mean, he's over there from the New York area, I believe from Brooklyn. Have you ever heard of him in the MMA world?
I've heard the name. I don't know if the fan base has dialed in as again, boxing is my first combat sport before the UFC was. I was watching boxing with my dad in the 80s and 90s before the first UFC event. So I'm never not paying attention to boxing. I feel honestly. I feel like if they did that here in the Garden, that would probably be maybe folks around here wouldn't even know, especially like the OG guys from my neighborhood would they wouldn't even, there's a UFC, they'd be like, there's a UFC this weekend if it was around here, but because it's not, you know what I mean? It's like those guys are still probably more dialed into the Canelo fight though. But as far as Berlanga goes, I mean, I feel like he's not one of those guys that it's not like it's not like Trinidad and all, like everybody used to get real hyped up for other whoever was fighting the Mexican guy on a weekend like this. But yeah, no, I don't feel like he's as up. When the fight was announced, I didn't feel like it didn't get the response it deserved. I feel like it's getting more as we near it. I feel like now folks are paying attention because of the whole Mexican independence thing. But when it first got announced, I think people were kind of like what,
Right. No, absolutely. I think the criticism, and I'm sure obviously there's the fighters in the UFC and the MMA world who are like this or were like this at one point or another. But Canelo's been around. Canelo's one of those fighters who has fought essentially in multiple eras, and he's fought the best of the best in multiple eras. There's that doesn't happen with a lot of guys. Like your body has to survive the years of punishment and the discipline and all that. And Canelo's one of the last of that dying breed, at least currently, right? So let me ask you this as a as a combat sports fan, and obviously knowing about Canelo, and you said you grew up obviously with boxing first, and then you turned your attention to MMA and UFC and Bellator and all these other MMA companies when they started gaining traction. But is there anybody right now in the MMA world who might be like Canelo Alvarez, that they've kind of fought everybody, whether they won or lost? So like everybody that they fight is either going to be like a young guy who's coming up, maybe somebody like Berlanga, who, he's undefeated, 22-0. He's working his way up. He fought his way to a mandatory spot for Canelo's WBA World Championship. But is there somebody in the MMA world who kind of compares? I don't want to say compares like identically to Canelo, but in terms of like, yeah, they've been around for so long that like sometimes you just have to recycle opponents, or you just got to start fighting the younger guys.
I mean, it happens more often than you know in MMA. I mean, it literally like, oh my God, I can. There's so many fighters that when like if you saw the news, like Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson retired this past Friday from combat sports, and I remember his entire UFC run, his run with one championship, and you don't really, or maybe it's just me, I don't really notice that until they hang up the gloves. And it's almost like you don't want them to do that, but because it's like the younger fighters are eating the older ones, just they make their names off of them, and it happens a lot in MMA. Probably more so because I feel like in boxing you have guys like that can, especially. I mean, boxing is such a different sport in the sense that like people like to say. And that's one thing I hate about this weekend. They're making it like boxing versus MMA, which it shouldn't be, because it's all combat sports. They all use the same athletic commissions, sanctioning bodies. You know what I mean? Like we shouldn't be beefing with each other like this about the rule set. But I mean it's just under the rule sets that they compete under. Whoever's best in that rule set is who's going to win. So you can't talk about boxers versus MMA fighters because the rule set's what matters most. And the guys the thing of that I think that people forget about boxing when MMA fans like to hate on boxing is that they forget about, I always like to think about those movies or stories about a blind samurai, right? The samurai is so good because he's lost these other, he can't see. So he's really good with his sword because he can't see. And it's the same thing with other senses. Yeah. Yeah. So that's what boxing is to me. Boxing is the blind samurai. They're so good with footwork and they're punching combos and head movement because they don't have to focus on takedown defense and checking leg kicks and all these other things. You know what I mean? That's what makes it so good. Even Boss Rutan said like the thing is being able to slip punches with your hands down and not worry about ever getting hit. And that it's something that's masterful and it's very cerebral to fire that off to your body's nerves to react that way. So I feel like boxing never gets to, new MMA fans like to hate on boxing, but it's because they just don't know why it's called the sweet science. It's because of shit like that. But I'm rambling. To answer your question about legacy fights, there's so many. I mean, I can think about. I'm trying to think just off the top of my head. If you go back, I mean, I remember there was a time when they were feeding Chuck Liddell a bunch of guys to fight, and he kept putting them away until he got put away. It just keeps happening. Happened with Randy Couture for the longest because he was old. He was already old when he got into the sport. The thing that makes Mighty Mouse's retirement unique is because they were doing it to him, and he managed to leave as a champion. Like the guys he fought Adriano Moraes and won championship so many times that they had a trilogy, and he only lost one of the 3 fights that they had. And then they tried to do a mixed rules fight against their one of their big Muay Thai fighters, and all he did was survive the Muay Thai round until he got to the MMA round and he submitted the guy. And then it happens a lot in MMA. I can't think of any one fighter right now. Jesus, I mean, look at Israel Adesanya. He's picking up he just came back from taking time off after losing the title, and he picked up another loss. You know what I mean? And that's a guy to me that's still relatively young and new in the sport. But it already looks like they're throwing guys at him, to kind of like put him away so that the next star can be. But the UFC machine is like that, though. That's in the UFC. Overall in the sport, I mean, you could find it anywhere. John Wayne Parr in Muay Thai over at One Championship. I mean, there's so many guys like that have a legacy that you just don't know about it. But it happens so much in mixed fighting system sports that I can't even think of just one.
So for this actual fight, Canelo versus Berlanga, from my perspective, I think Canelo is the big favorite. Berlanga, I don't know if you would know, but he used to fight for Top Rank, which is Bob Arum's company. So he was fighting on ESPN a lot, and then a couple fights ago, he became a free agent. There was like reports that he wasn't accepting certain opponents from Top Rank because he had like a 12 KO or 15 KO win streak where he was just knocking all these guys out in like the first or second round of the fight. So, and then he came out with that rapper Fat Joe in New York. So he was kind of building a profile and he was getting popular. But then, like any levels in combat sport or anything in life, or especially sports, eventually you're going to have to go up a level. Like, okay, like you're knocking all these guys out. We got to get you somebody a little bit more experienced. Yeah. So he started fighting those guys. He wasn't knocking them out. He was going the distance. You could see like, okay, he's, now he's found a curve here. But because he's so young, and Canelo Alvarez is literally the most experienced, most dangerous opponent he's fought to this point, maybe ever in his career. I don't know. He's still a young guy, so you never know. But in combat sports, Ed, because sometimes, especially in boxing, but obviously in MMA, sometimes those like the big favorites or the heavy betting odds favorites, they end up losing, and it's a huge upset. It's a huge upset. Then they talk about the betting odds, like, oh yeah, these X amount of people at the MGM or Mandalay Bay bet on the underdog, and they bet $100 and they won $5,000 or something. How do you think? How do you think that notion as a combat sports fan kind of gives boxing and MMA its uniqueness? Where there's always going to be underdogs in sports, but in combat sports, there's a difference when you compare it to football, soccer, basketball, baseball, and all that.
It's the what if factor is such a big draw no matter the rule set, whatever, when you book something where that what if factor exists, it's what makes people pay attention. I think it was called what is it called? The Fight Business. There was it's a Netflix documentary, and Bruce Buffer's the one that says, like, no matter what sport you're in, if you're at a football game and a fight breaks out in the crowd, everybody's eyes will stop watching the game and they start watching the fight.
That's a good analogy. Yeah.
It's something. It's Bruce Buffer. I can't remember the name of the doc. I think it was called Fight Inc. or for the Fight or the Hurt Business. I think it's called the Hurt Business. It's something about in our human nature that when we see combat sports, when we're drawn to it, I think the thing that draws us is because you don't know what's going to happen, regardless of experience and records. All it takes is one thing to turn the tide. Somebody's knee goes out, or the guy lands a good punch that gets people, that gets someone doing the stanky leg, as the kids say now. You know what I mean? I think about like one of those times was like George St. Pierre versus Matt Serra the first time. Everybody thought George St. Pierre was just going to walk through Matt Serra because he walked through everybody at that time. He was running through everybody. Matt Serra threw one punch, caught him with one punch that changed the whole. That's how he became champion. And I think that's what we're looking at here when it comes to the matchup. Like you said, he's young, and people always kind of want to see when is the old lion going to get who's going to be the guy to dethrone him, right? And Canelo's been the guy for a long time. I honestly don't see him losing this weekend, but if it happens, I mean, it's going to be one of those things that but especially if it's a punch that he doesn't see coming and it puts him away. I mean, that's going to be something that people will be talking about until freaking Wednesday of next week. You know what I mean? like it's like, remember when we with Joshua and Ruiz, right? Anthony and Josh, when he lost to Andy Ruiz, like nobody. I remember I put money on Ruiz just because I was like, what? I saw the ridiculous odds, and he knocked him out. And I remember exactly where I was sitting. I was like, I stood up in my buddy's apartment like this, and he was like, "Why?" And I was like, "Because I put money on him just because fucking around." And he was plus. I remember because it was plus 1,300, and I was like, "Oh my god, yeah!" And it was like, so stuff like that. I think is what makes it entertaining. And like as we near the weekend, and we're talking on Monday, so that's this Saturday. I mean, just talking about it, of all my notes, I didn't look up odds for this weekend. I didn't look up the
Well, I
odds.
think like you said, like I mentioned earlier, but like Canelo's a huge favorite, and I've seen some odds, with different sports books and all that, and they're significant, But like you said, like there's always that what if factor in fighting, in the fight game and combat sports, and like you mentioned, I think the Anthony Joshua and Andy Ruiz fight, that's a perfect example. Andy Ruiz came in as a late replacement for Big Baby Miller, who had tested positive for everything under the sun around that time. So he got removed from that fight. And the crazy thing about it is that Andy Ruiz was on our show here on the last round, like about 2 weeks before he got that fight.
Oh, wow.
It was like about a week and a half, maybe almost 2 weeks. He was on our show, and there was already like reports that AJ needed an opponent. So if you go back, if anybody wants to listen to that in our catalog, just type in Andy Ruiz. Andy Ruiz says on there, he's like, "Hey, Eddie Hearn, reach out to me. I messaged you. I'll step in right now." Because Andy Ruiz, I think, had just fought out here in Los Angeles, and I think he knocked the guy out in a couple rounds, and he didn't get hurt or anything, so he was fresh. Or it was something like that. He had just fought like the month before. It was very, very recent. And then 2 weeks later, he ended up getting the fight. But like you said, it was such a big event over there in New York in terms of boxing because Anthony Joshua, it's his first time fighting in the United States. He's fighting at Madison Square Garden. And he's such a big favorite. And AJ is one of those fighters, not just one of those fighters, but he's one of those athletes. He's got that movie star look. He's like 6'6", ripped, 260, 270 pounds. He just, sometimes those athletes, these actors and these athletes have that movie star look. They're just born with it. And then he gets knocked out by, a 5'11", 290 pound Mexican American guy who, he was a good fighter, but like you said, the betting odds were not in his favor.
Yeah.
But let me ask you this, like, would you have remembered that fight if that didn't happen, and especially because if you didn't put money on Ruiz?
Yeah, of course not. No, because then it would have been like everybody predicted, right? Like if these guys, it's like you think about the old days with Mike Tyson, or pre-Buster Douglas Mike Tyson. It was guaranteed, like everybody was just paying their $20 because pay-per-views were like $20, $25 back then. But everybody was just watching the fight, like, let's see how long this guy lasts against Tyson. You know what I mean? Like they're just watching to see something. It's like watching to see somebody do, like watching Dave Chappelle do his stand-up set. He's good at what he does, and you just kind of want to see it. But when the opposite happens, man, that's the thing that and it's that Sports Business Journal piece that I read. They put a quote in there that Dana White likes to say, about what he does for a living, and he says I like to create holy shit moments, and that's all of combat sports, right? Like we all tune in for those holy shit moments, and when we get them, I mean, it's what keeps us coming back, next weekend and next weekend and next weekend, because we want to see more of those. And you never know when they're going to come.
No, absolutely not. Yeah. But that's the beauty of combat sports as a whole. And then also just quickly running down that card in the co-main event of the Canelo Alvarez versus Edgar Berlanga main event and card, Erislandy Lara, a former opponent of Canelo Alvarez. I think they fought 10 years ago, 2014, I believe, is one of Canelo's toughest fights. And a lot of people, there was a lot of people at the time and even now who thought he should have lost that fight, but he actually won it, I believe, by split decision. It was a very close fight. It was a very dangerous opponent for him to take at the time. I remember Oscar De La Hoya said he wasn't in favor of Canelo taking that fight at the time, but Canelo wanted it. But Lara returns to defend his middleweight title, his WBA middleweight title at 160 pounds against former 147-pound champion Danny Swift Garcia of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So that should be an interesting fight. The thing with these guys, though, is that Danny Garcia hasn't fought in a couple years. He's still a name, but he's he's kind of like Conor McGregor, where he comes every 2-3 years, so it kind of sucks.
Yeah, well, you said something though. I mean, you were mentioning it before we recorded too about the history that Canelo has with a couple of guys on this card, and I think that's something that speaks to for Lara. Like when you look at the quality of opponents someone has faced versus who their opponent has faced, I think that says a lot about them, win or lose. Like I think that says a lot about what they're going to bring to the table in their next fight. You know what I mean? Versus somebody that it's almost like they're being fed to them if they haven't faced the same quality level of opponents. And I think that's something that translates through all combat sports. I know this is for the WBA middleweight title, right?
Yeah, the co-main, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. I'm pretty sure because of, if I was an odds maker, I would say Lara is probably the favorite in this one, right?
You know what? I that's a good question. I mean, the thing is that Lara's older. I think he might be like in his early 40s. Danny Garcia is younger. I think he's like in his mid 30s. But the inactivity for these guys, especially Danny Garcia, it could be significant. Like if we look at maybe a more recent example in boxing, Errol Spence versus Terrence Crawford last year. Spence, even though he was unified champion, he was doing well, 147. Like he's an excellent fighter. But the thing is, for him fighting for Al Heyman, a lot of those guys who are represented by Al Heyman, they had trouble with consistent activity. And I mean, I think, in combat sports, especially, like if you need to be active. You need to be active. I mean, sometimes there's guys out there that are just freaks of nature. Like they can fight once every 2 years and, they're just, they still have it. It doesn't matter like if they fought 3 times before in that same year, but most of the time activity matters. So you need to be consistent, right?
Yeah, for sure. For Spectation Sports, I interview a lot of fighters, and that's one of the things, especially the guys on the regional scene as they're coming up. One of the things that irks them the most is when they can't get fights. If you, I mean, I don't think it happens as often as boxing as it does in MMA, especially in recent years since COVID. But last minute replacement fighters, it's almost there's almost I don't want to call it a stigma because there's fighters that like it, but they stay within 8 pounds of their fighting weight because they're literally sitting home checking their phones, waiting for call ups for fights. And that's been one thing that of all the fighters I talked to. And these are for guys that were in the UFC and they're no longer anymore. And, they fought in Bellator, they fought for LFA, and they all say the same thing. Like they want to stay busy. They want to, I got to get at least 3 fights this year, like activity does matter for a lot. Cause I think you can get complacent. Like, one thing that stood out to me that Mighty Mouse said when he retired this past weekend was, cause he did his trilogy with Moraes. He told the fans, and he was like, he took a year off. He kept training, but he took the year off of competing in MMA because he did jiu-jitsu competitions. But he said that he took the year off to see if he was going to get an itch to want to come back, and he did not. And that's what helped him make the decision to retire at 38 years old. So I feel like the guys that have that itch to stay busy, that speaks to a lot to what they're bringing into the ring or the cage, depending whatever sport it is. The guy that wants to fight, the guy that wants to stay busy, the guys that need time. When you start hearing them, they want to take time off. There's guys that they'll take time off and then it's like 4 days and they're back in the gym. But then there's guys that they take time off and they're like, you hear after the fact, they're like, yeah, you know what? I took time off and I said, let me take another week, and another week turned into 2 weeks. Then it turned to a month, and then I decided I want to retire,
Yeah. No, that's true. I mean, and staying on the topic of activity, and especially when you make significant amount of money that's, you could consider life-changing.
Yeah.
You're just like, oh, well, I have financial security. There's that, I'm sure you've heard it, in the past. It's a pretty popular quote, especially in the boxing circles. But it's by Marvelous Marvin Hagler. I think he had said famously once that And I pulled it up here because I wanted to get it right. Where he said, "quote It's tough to get out of bed to do road work at 5 a.m. when you've been sleeping in silk pajamas."
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's true, right?
Yeah, look at Conor McGregor, right? Like,
Exactly.
Perfect
he's a prime
example.
example, man.
Yeah. Perfect example.
No, he's a prime example, man.
Yeah.
I mean, it's true, and I mean, who in the UFC would you say? Because there's a couple fighters like that in boxing. I think Canelo Alvarez would probably be the most significant example, where he's obviously a multimillionaire, very, very successful, rich. I'm sure he sleeps in silk pajamas. I think he showed up to press conferences and weigh-ins in silk outfits and stuff like that. So, but he's disciplined. Fight twice a year. Every so often he'll fight in December 3 times a year. I mean,
what's the most damage he's taken in a because I think that's another thing in MMA, especially when fighters start thinking about hanging it up, because it's making me think about Dustin Poirier is why I'm asking the question. Dustin Poirier is taking a lot of damage. That he's at the point where he teeters. He's talking about doing one more fight, but now he wants the fight to be worth his. He wants him to be money fight. He doesn't care like title run. Okay, but the money's what matters more right now, and more often than not, when I hear fighters talk about hinting about whether they want to keep doing it, I think it's because of how they wear damage afterwards. And I can't think of any fight. where Canelo like has walked away with a lot of damage that like he doesn't go to the press conference after. Not that I can think of. You would know better than me, but off the top of my head, I don't recall him looking particularly worse for wear after any of his fights, even the questionable ones. Right. No, yeah, and I think you're right too, because I can't think of any. And he's taking some damage and some shots, especially in the Triple G fights, the Gennady Golovkin fights. Those two went to war with each other. Yeah. And then he fought the Russian Dmitry Bivol a couple years ago at 175 pounds, where he lost that fight. And he didn't get knocked down or anything like that, but Bivol was taking it to him because Bivol's already a big guy, and Canelo was fighting at 175 pounds, which isn't his weight class. But yeah, I think, like you said, taking damage. You mentioned Dustin Poirier. I think you're right. Once you start taking that damage, or even if it's that one fight, you take significant damage and you have to go to the hospital. And as a human being, you're going to reevaluate. Like, oh man, like how much longer should I go? Yeah,
right?
Yeah. Because I mean, if anyone that's done any sort of, I don't know if you have folks that train and listen to this podcast, but when I look at myself, I'm not a young man anymore. Versus 20 years ago, I remember taking a lot of damage and feeling fresh as a daisy in 2-3 days, versus now, if I have a couple of hard training sessions, I got to take 2-3 days to chill. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. And maybe
you're a black belt for our listeners. You're a black belt in jiu-jitsu, right?
Yeah. I still train, but it's not. That's why I'm saying what I'm saying is like I remember being able to take, when I used to do kickboxing, and I remember taking a lot of shots and being, because I'm Mexican, so of course I'd walk forward and absorb a lot just so I can send a lot of punches back. You know what I mean? Like, you know what I'm talking about. And then I remember the day in my mid-30s when I got caught with an uppercut on the chin, and I never felt that before. And I went back and, this thing started spinning, and I was like, wow, this never happened to me before. And I'd been kickboxing since I was, striking arts since I was 16 years old. And that was the first time that I really had my bell rung. And shout out to Rudy, as a Dominican guy that did it to me. But
never forget his name.
Yeah, of course not. But I was like, holy cow. And then that's when I was like, hey, might be too old for this shit, Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. Like, I think that wearing the damage and how you carry it afterwards, it matters a lot. So, I think Canelo's been fortunate. Canelo's fortunate, and like you said, if I think that matters a lot when it comes to when you're looking at these fights. I feel like in boxing, though, guys, there's been more older boxers than there's been MMA fighters. And I think about Bernard Hopkins, you know.
Yeah. Even Roy Jones. I think Roy Jones fought into his 40s, maybe even 50s.
Yeah.
I don't know, but no, you're right. I could agree with that. And then also on the card, Caleb Plant versus Trevor McCumbee at 168 pounds. Like we talked about earlier, Caleb Plant, another former Canelo opponent. Rolly Romero versus Manuel Jaimes for the super lightweight clash. Rolly Romero obviously fought Tank Davis a couple years ago, got knocked out. Stephen
That's
Fulton,
the opener, right? Is that the opening bout?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, and then Stephen Fulton versus Carlos Castro in a featherweight clash. Stephen Fulton fought Naoya Inoue, the monster from Japan, earlier this year, I believe, and got stopped in Japan. That was a good fight too. And I don't know if you know about Naoya.
That's a boxer that a lot of MMA fans know about. Inoue, like it's just, he's got some fans. Yeah.
That guy's a monster, man. Like he's like. Everybody asks about pound for pound, like to me, and everybody has their biases and stuff like that. You're like, oh, we Crawford and stuff like that. To me, he's the best fighter. He's the best boxer in the world, like pound for pound. I know Crawford's there and stuff like that, but I put a little bit more stock into Inoue because he's consistently active, a lot more active than Crawford has been. But some people disagree, which is fine. But that's the nature.
What do you think? What do you think causes that? Like in boxing nowadays, like I can speak. I remember having a lot of these debates back when I was only watching boxing. But what do you think causes it now? Because like with MMA, it's because the UFC is so in your face and it's such a big marketing machine. Everybody thinks the UFC. There's only the UFC. That people don't even talk about MMA. They think UFC is MMA and not the other way around. So what do you think causes that in boxing nowadays? Because like I just said why it happens in MMA, but what do you think causes it in boxing these days? Because I'm with you. I like where your head is at with Inoue.
Yeah. He is. People talk about nicknames in combat sports. Like that guy is a monster, and he's like 5'5", But in terms of your question, the pound for pound list in MMA and boxing and all that is always going to be subjective, highly subjective and stuff like that. But I think, and Mike and I have had this conversation in past episodes multiple times, but I think because we came from an era where Mayweather dominated for so many years consistently, and he was literally as universal as you can get in terms of the consensus pound for pound best fighter in the world. There was such a consensus for that guy. And then when he left, it was wide open. And then Canelo, had it for a little bit. We're like, oh yeah, Canelo. But then like the monster Inoue came in and he's been just dominating for a couple years straight now. And then Crawford came in, especially after Crawford's win against Errol Spence last year, where he just dominated that guy. And that fight had been built up for years. And then, Crawford just won his first title at 154 pounds out here in Los Angeles, moving up in weight. I just think that because like there's no, they talk about money, fighters get paid so much. And a lot of people refer it as to the Mayweather effect, because he made so much money, he increased the value of fighters' purses. But, I just think that, there's not, Canelo's a superstar and he is known. Yeah, he is a superstar, but I don't think he's as known as Floyd Mayweather was during Mayweather's prime. Canelo's still world renowned. He is. It's not that he's not. He's a superstar. But there was a level between Mayweather and even Pacquiao at the time. There was a level. There was a level of popularity there that they knew their names. So yeah, I just think that there's multiple fighters, 3 or 4 fighters, maybe even 5 fighters in boxing right now who, like, the monster Inoue, Terrence Crawford, even Canelo, if you want to throw him in there. And then there's some other guys, that people might not know about, but that you're like, there's a guy who fights at, I think, 112, Jesse Bam Rodriguez. He gets trained by Robert Garcia, the famous Mexican-American trainer Robert Garcia. Jesse Bam Rodriguez is like maybe in his mid-20s, but he's a killer. He started fighting at, I think, 108, then 112, then he won titles at 115. Now he's talking about going to 118, But, the lower weight classes, especially in boxing, they're not as sexy. So, the reason somebody like Inoue in Japan, the reason he's become so popular is because he's in Japan. He's a superstar over there. Like, because of him, like, he had all his fights over there are on Prime Video on Amazon. But he's a superstar over there. Like, he's a legitimate celebrity. I just think that there's no Mayweather anymore. Like, in terms of, like, he was just such a consensus. But you also got to look at it too. Like, social media, especially the last 10 years, has really dominated conversations. People can on demand put their opinions out there. So, you can shape a narrative. And Mayweather kind of got out just before it really, really blew up. So I think he kind of avoided it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's what I think. I mean,
yeah. I mean, I guess that's the case with boxing. It's just like I said with MMA, the UFC saturates the sport so much that people don't even know about guys like, the Mighty Mouse thing is kind of still. I'm surprised it's not being talked about more. That he's hung up his gloves on Friday. I mean, there was a couple of years ago. There was a couple of fighters that I thought could have given. I still think because he's no longer with one championship. Or Rene de Ridder, who's a Dutch fighter that he was the middleweight and light heavyweight champion at one. I thought he could give. I still think he could give Israel Adesanya and Dricus du Plessis a run for their money. The heavyweight champion right now. I don't know if you look up Anatoly Malikin, he's going to fight on the Atlanta card in October. This guy is literally looks like the Incredible Hulk. He's one's heavyweight champion, looks like a Russian Incredible Hulk, and I've never seen somebody that big. Usually when you think about heavyweight fighters, you don't think about them having high output. Rennet, the other guy just mentioned, they fought twice. And Malikin beat him twice. And the game plan de Ridder had against him the second time, if you're someone that knows about fighting, it's a sound plan. Okay, I'm going to attack the body. I'm going to make him tired. I'm not going to engage him. I'm not going to let him grab me if grabbing is part of the fight. Okay, so he did all these things correctly, and this man just didn't get tired. None of it worked. All he did was absorb the punches and keep coming at him and throwing every single strike like 100%. You can see it if you go to One Championship's YouTube channel, watch that fight, and you'll literally be like, how is this guy human? Like if he went to the UFC, he would literally already be in the top 10.
The Incredible Hulk, huh?
Anatoly Malikin. I don't know what he calls himself, what his fight name is. Apparently he does some pro wrestling too over wherever he's from. But
really?
The dude is a unique specimen of a human being. Like, I'm telling you, check him out. When we're done recording, just watch his fights and he will make you say, holy shit, like this dude's got his blood must be like Red Bull or something.
Like Red Bull, that's a good one. Yeah. Let's end on this. Let me ask you to, if you can, make a speculative prediction here. The Canelo versus Berlanga fight pay-per-view price here in the United States is $89.99. What is the UFC's, if you know it, and how many buys do you think the UFC event sells this Saturday?
Well, so we never really know what the buy rate is because it's behind the ESPN Plus paywall. So those numbers don't get put out there. The UFC gets paid regardless,
right?
By ESPN. As far as actual buys, the price is about the same. So pay-per-views are all about the same. I think they're doing a special that if you don't have ESPN Plus and you sign up for it and order the pay-per-view, you get a discount. So that way it'll be cheaper. But as far as we have to wait for the numbers to come out Monday, Tuesday to see who really makes out financially on the business side of things.
But now that TKO owns them and TKO is a publicly traded company, I mean, is there any chance that we see it in a future disclosure, like quarterly SEC filing or anything?
Oh, I would think it would come out if the deal with ESPN is over, because all that stuff we find out after the fact anyway, especially, that antitrust lawsuit, we're finding out stuff from years ago with undisclosed purses and things like that. You know what I mean? Under the table, locker room bonuses and all that stuff that's been coming out over the years. So yeah, we'll find that out eventually. It always gets found out because money's being exchanged hands. Somebody's there's a ledger somewhere. If you watch any sort of like documentary about where investigative work is done, there's always a ledger somewhere.
There is. There's always a ledger somewhere. What a line to say about combat sports, huh? Well, Ed, obviously you're a lifesaver this week. Subbing in for Mike, as I mentioned, he should be back next week. So hopefully he's back here in my co-host seat next week. But Ed, before we completely sign off here, like I said, you have a couple different places where people can find you. You also have your own podcast with your co-host Matt Hawkins, the Coast to Coast Combat Hour. Go ahead and plug whatever else you got, man.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to follow everything I do, just find me on Twitter at Carbajal. Again, the podcast is Coast to Coast Combat Hour on Spotify. I do that with Matt Hawkins. SpectationSports.com if you want to watch some regional MMA. And some boxing on there too. Local southeastern region, I want to say, but we were expanding. It's a streaming service. It's been around for a while now. So if you sign up for it and use my code is Carbajal, you get like 20% off your first month or your annual subscription. And I've had a newsletter for a while. I'm trying to grow it. So I just moved it over to a new platform. So if you sign up for my newsletter, I sent Danny the link to add to the description, but it's also, again, just follow me on Twitter. Everything I do is always posted there.
At Carbajal, Carbazeel, right?
Yeah, Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. That's where
Twitter, X. I feel it's taking me a long time to really. I think Twitter just rolls off the tongue a little bit better. That's probably why people say it.
Yeah,
it's been
it's
so
hard
many years with that name.
Yeah,
but I'm sure eventually we'll switch it off. But I forgot to mention at the beginning of the show, we are now on YouTube with our episodes. So anytime we upload an episode, it'll immediately upload to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/@the-last-round-boxing-podcast. If you just YouTube search the Last Round Podcast or the Last Round Boxing Podcast, our logo, our cartoon logo of Mike and I should pop up right there. You click it. Our whole catalog is on there and updates every time we upload a new episode. So if you're a YouTube type of person or you have YouTube Premium or whatever you got, you can switch from listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all that stuff and listen on YouTube. But we're still on all these other podcast platforms. So if you like your usual routine, you can keep it going as well. But for once again, my guest of the week, and Ed Carbajal. I almost called you Carbajal. Your last name is actually Carbajal. Ed Carbajal, Spectation Sports, and the Coast to Coast Combat Hour. I'm Danny Z. This is The Last Round.
Thanks for supporting and listening to the show. Follow us at The Last Round 12 on social media. Rate, review, and subscribe. This is The Last Round Podcast.